Compression can be one of the most musical tools we have, and how different engineers use it really defines their style more than anything else. Today we're going to explore some ways compression can be used beyond its standard use as a dynamic tool. It is my intention to bring to light some of the techniques that Jack Joseph Puig was referring to in that interview, based on my own research and experimentation, and I hope that they will empower you to take your mixes to the next level, or at the very least, view compression as more than level control. Before we begin, if you haven't already, please check out my video on dynamic filtering as well as my series on compression, where I cover the basics of compression and more advanced topics such as parallel, series, side chaining, and pre-compression. These will provide a framework for the content in this video. Also, to avoid confusion, I'll be referring to high or low threshold settings with respect to the level of the signal coming into the compressor, not necessarily the dialed in setting on the compressor itself. For example, if a signal coming in is very low, then the threshold setting on the compressor will barely register any gain reduction because the signal is only just reaching the threshold. So relative to the incoming signal, this is similar to a high threshold setting on a louder signal coming into the compressor, which would also barely register any gain reduction. Let's get down to it. Here's a snare drum. I've set the compressor threshold to grab the loudest parts of the sound, so it is, relatively speaking, a high threshold. We have a fast release so that we can only hear what the attack is doing to the sound, and the ratio is set to 4:1, which will be high enough to accentuate the effect of our attack settings. If I bypass the compression, you hear that the sound is up front and close. And back in. As I dial in a shorter attack time, you'll notice that the snare becomes somewhat distant, dull, or darker. The reason is because of the faster attack setting, as we now have an instrument which is missing a lot of that initial high frequency, high energy transient at the beginning. So consequently, it feels darker and has less presence. Notice though, as I open up the attack to a longer setting, the compressor lets more of that initial transient through. If I open the attack up fully, we're getting no compression, and the front end of the sound is restored to its former glory, thus providing us with the brighter of the two sounds. We can, however, make it seem somewhat brighter still by accentuating the transient part of the sound. I'm going to pull down the attack now until the compressor starts to react to the transient front end of the snare. We don't want it to compress the transient, we just want to get the compressor to the stage where it starts to compress, and then dial it back a bit. Due to the short release time I've selected, the compressor stops reacting to the initial transient very quickly and then releases its grip on the snare drum, and in fact is not compressing at all. If, however, I lengthen the release time, the compressor clamps down just after the transient for the length of time that I've set for the release. In fact, the compressor is reacting to the front end of the sound because it's the loudest, but because we've chosen a longer attack setting, it actually starts compressing the tail end of the sound. In this case, you want to try to set the release to be as long as possible and to time it so that the compressor releases before the next hit. To finish, match the volume of the original by ear by applying some makeup gain. Now, with the longer release, we have changed the relative volume of the transient part of the sound to the sustained part of the sound, which gives the impression that the sound has become a tad brighter. Granted, it is difficult to hear, as it's not so much the addition of higher frequencies as it is a loss of lower ones. It's a bit like subtractive EQ, which, as we know, is much harder to hear than additive EQ. The effects of the attack control can be fairly subtle, but it might just be what's needed to either sit an instrument further back in the mix or to allow it to cut through it. So, without an EQ in sight, we have a built-in presence control inside our compressor. This technique can be applied to a variety of instruments that have transients, not just the snare drum. You may, however, need to lengthen both the attack and release controls to accommodate other instrument types in order to keep the compression sounding more natural. Smaller compression ratios can also help in this area. Remember too that you can also listen through and engage the sidechain filters of the compressor to focus purely on the attack part of the instrument, which resides in the mid-range. We could roughly define this mid-range to be anywhere between 600 Hz to 3 or 4K. So, shorten the attack to make the sound feel more distant or dark, or lengthen it to make the instrument feel closer and brighter in combo with a short release. Extend the release time further with a longer attack and with some added makeup gain to bring up the level of the transients. Compression is usually my first port of call when it comes to tone shaping, sometimes before I even consider putting an EQ over a track, and almost always before I consider replacing a sound with a sample. Sometimes the tone is just waiting to be unlocked by the right compressor with the right approach, and the side effects of compression sometimes prove more fruitful. Tone lives inside the part of the sound which follows the initial peak or transient energy. It can be the ringing of the snare drum that follows the snap of the stick or the sustain from a guitar strum after the initial pluck of the strings. We can shape the tone by simply running the instruments through a compressor without compressing at all, which is a very subtle approach that may be more apparent across an entire mix bus or group than a single instrument. Another approach, which I employ in my mixes when needed, involves hitting the compressor hard in order to bring out the character of the overdriven unit. But this doesn't necessarily mean that I'll be needing to use high ratios. For instance, a 3:1 ratio with a low threshold grabbing onto the signal with plenty of makeup gain will almost certainly add loads of character to the tone of any instrument. In such a setup, the tone will usually contain the sound of the room in which the microphone was recording the instrument in, as this is brought up in volume by the lower threshold. How does the compressor impart its character? Well, typically compressors impart their unique EQ signature over the signal based on how they see and react to the incoming frequencies. Different parts of the spectrum get squashed at different times and rates, which can also be changing in real time and at different gain reduction stages. The result is a coloring of the sound that could perhaps be best described as a form of harmonic distortion. When compressing for character, aim to select a compressor that's not too transparent. You will need to experiment to find out which compressors you prefer for their tonal character, and you can learn this by simply driving an instrument into them fairly hard to see what happens while playing with the settings. You'll soon work out what you like the sound of and what you don't. In this rather extreme example, I'm going to induce some distortion on a rock bass guitar using the standard DigiDesign compressor. To start off with, I'm going to leave my attack wide open, that is, as long as possible. The release very short and the ratio set to 4:1 as a starting point. I'll then lower the threshold as I play through the track until I hear the sound start to get significantly smaller, and then just back it off a touch. This should serve as a good starting point for the threshold setting. I'm also going to readjust the makeup gain as I change each setting. Here's where I think it starts to get interesting as far as tonal possibilities are concerned. Gradually shorten the attack until you start to hear the unit crap out like a broken speaker. About 2 or 3 milliseconds in this case. What I like to do then at this point is engage the low filter in the sidechain section. I start pushing that up to let some of the bass back through and leave it at around 120 Hz, where it's apparent that enough bass is passing back through uncompressed. I then move back over to the attack and shorten it further. Pay attention to the tone though, as the attack gets shorter. You should notice that the tone changes from a deep bass distortion to a higher frequency distortion. So in this case, the attack control has essentially become a tone control for our distortion. Back over to our low filter on the sidechain. Here there is a specific range of frequencies on the filter which you'll now be able to use to make the distortion a bit more edgy sounding. They will start at 120 Hz, which are already determined to be roughly at the bottom of the range, and go up to the point where the distortion disappears. Increase the ratio, less than decrease it. I could definitely see this being used on rock, grunge, or a punk song, but if the sound doesn't really appeal to you, try substituting a different compressor in its place. For a more controlled and subtle sound, we can simply blend it in parallel with the original track. Let's see how that sounds. Nice. But I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what if I slap some automation over my attack control and ran the compressor through a telephone effect EQ with a chord note timed one band resonating filter? I could read minds. That's pretty crazy, but kind of cool. We already looked at enhancing transients by making an instrument brighter, but this is only part of the process. Artificially making the instrument feel later in the timeline. So what I'd like to introduce is perhaps a not so obvious approach. together a group of amateur musicians who can't play to save their own lives, which is not something I would normally recommend. But we can use that to our advantage.